"Don't send that suitcase downstairs," the black teenage boy shouted across the airport terminal, his voice cutting through the rolling wheels and boarding announcements just as a baggage employee grabbed the faded gray suitcase from the lost and found counter. Heads turned. A few travelers slowed. Most kept walking. The employee barely glanced at him. "Step back, kid," he said, pulling the suitcase toward a steel cart marked unclaimed property. "You don't have any claim to this bag." 17-year-old Elijah Brooks froze for only a heartbeat before hurrying forward again, his worn charcoal hoodie hanging loosely over his shoulders, an old backpack bouncing against his back. He wasn't angry. He wasn't loud anymore. His eyes stayed locked on the suitcase as though every second mattered. "Please," he said, lowering his voice. "Just don't move it yet." A security officer immediately stepped between them. "That's enough." Elijah stopped without resisting. His hands stayed where everyone could see them. He slowly reached into his pocket, not for a phone or a wallet, but for a weathered airline baggage tag with faded ink and frayed edges. He stared at the numbers printed across it before looking back at the suitcase. The tag trembled slightly between his fingers. The officer noticed. So did a woman standing several yards away near the premium check-in lounge. Caroline Whitmore had spent decades making billion-dollar decisions without hesitation. Dressed in a cream-colored tailored pantsuit, she was on her way to finalize an international business agreement worth more money than most people would earn in several lifetimes. Yet something about the boy's face made her pause. He wasn't looking at the employees. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was watching only the suitcase, as though it might disappear forever if someone rolled it another 10 feet. "Is he trying to steal it?" one traveler whispered. "Looks that way," another answered before anyone knew a single fact. Caroline folded her arms but remained silent. She had learned long ago that appearances often hid expensive mistakes, yet airport procedures existed for a reason. The baggage employee clipped another barcode onto the suitcase. "Final transfer," he announced. Elijah took one careful step forward again. "If you seal that new label over the old one," his sentence stopped halfway. He bit his lip, as though saying anything more would reveal something he desperately needed to protect. Another curiosity settled over the growing crowd. Why would a teenager care about an old baggage sticker? Why carry a matching tag that looked decades older than anything still used by the airline? The officer extended a hand. "Give me the tag." Elijah hesitated only a moment before surrendering it. The officer studied the faded numbers, frowned, then compared them with the suitcase resting on the cart. They were almost identical, but one digit didn't match. Around them, murmurs spread through the terminal. "See," someone muttered. "He made the whole thing up." Caroline glanced from the tag to the boy, expecting disappointment to flash across his face. Instead, Elijah quietly whispered, almost to himself, "They changed it." Before anyone could ask what he meant, an older airport employee walking past the counter suddenly stopped cold, stared at the battered baggage tag in the officer's hand, and went completely pale. The older employee did not blink. He reached toward the baggage tag with the cautious hands of someone touching a memory instead of a piece of paper. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his steady airport voice suddenly uneven. Elijah answered without pulling away. "It belongs to my father." The surrounding chatter faded just enough for Caroline Whitmore to hear those 5 words. The employee looked back at the faded print, then shook his head. "That design has not been used here in years." The security officer folded his arms. "Then it proves even less. We still have an unclaimed suitcase and a teenager interfering with airport operations." Elijah swallowed, but instead of arguing, he looked at the gray suitcase again. "Please, before you cover the old label." The baggage employee sighed impatiently and reached for another adhesive strip. Caroline stepped closer for the first time. "Would it cost anything to wait 2 minutes?" she asked. The supervisor answered before anyone else could. "Ma'am, procedures exist for a reason. Every delayed transfer creates paperwork." Caroline did not argue. She simply watched Elijah. His breathing remained calm, but his eyes never left one corner of the suitcase where several layers of worn stickers overlapped like pages from forgotten years. Most people would never have noticed. He clearly had. The older employee leaned toward the suitcase without touching it. "Turn it slightly." The baggage handler rolled it a few inches. A narrow section hidden beneath the handle came into view. The employee frowned. "That is strange." The newest barcode covered nearly everything, yet a tiny fragment of faded blue lettering still peeked from beneath the edge. Before anyone could inspect it more closely, another worker arrived, pushing a scanner. "Transfer truck is here." The scanner beeped as it read the fresh barcode. "Destination confirmed." Elijah's shoulders dropped. For the first time since he had shouted across the terminal, disappointment crossed his face. He slowly stepped backward instead of forward. Caroline noticed the change immediately. If the boy had been trying to steal the suitcase, this would have been the moment to panic or run. Instead, he quietly slipped the old baggage tag back into his pocket and whispered, "Then it is too late." Something about those words unsettled her more than the shouting ever had. She turned toward the older employee. "You recognize that tag?" He hesitated. "Not the tag exactly." His eyes remained fixed on the hidden blue lettering beneath the new label. "I remember seeing that color years ago. They stopped printing baggage numbers like that after." He stopped himself before finishing. The security supervisor cleared his throat. "Whatever history lesson this is can wait. Move the suitcase." The cart rolled forward only a few feet before the older employee suddenly raised his voice. "Stop." Everyone froze again. He pointed toward the small strip of blue beneath the barcode. "That is not part of the airline label." The supervisor frowned. "Then what is it?" The employee took one slow step closer, his expression growing paler with every inch. "If my eyes are still as good as they used to be." He leaned forward, barely breathing. "That is a maintenance archive marker. Those were never supposed to leave airport storage." Silence swept across the terminal. Even the baggage handler loosened his grip on the cart. Then, without warning, a radio on the supervisor's shoulder crackled to life. "Operations Control to Terminal 3. We have located an archived maintenance report connected to an unclaimed suitcase. Do not release that baggage until further notice. Repeat, do not release that baggage." The terminal changed without anyone announcing it. A moment earlier, people had been hurrying toward gates and coffee shops. Now every eye followed the gray suitcase as though it had become the center of the airport. The security supervisor reached for his radio. "Operations Control, repeat the reason for the hold." Static filled the silence before a calm voice answered. "Possible historical property. Await records verification before transfer." The words puzzled everyone except the older employee, whose expression grew heavier with every passing second. Caroline Whitmore glanced at her watch. Her meeting was less than 30 minutes away, yet she made no move toward the executive lounge. Instead, she stepped beside Elijah, leaving several feet of respectful distance between them. "You expected something like this?" she said quietly. Elijah kept his eyes on the suitcase. "I hoped I was not too late." That answer only deepened the mystery. Two airport operations managers arrived carrying electronic tablets. One of them pulled up decades-old storage records while the other compared the faded maintenance marker with archived images. Their brows tightened. "There is a match," one finally admitted. "But the file is incomplete." The supervisor frowned. "Incomplete how?" "Half the digital record is missing." A ripple of whispers swept through the growing crowd. Elijah remained silent. Caroline watched him carefully. Most teenagers placed under this much attention would try to explain themselves. He did the opposite. He waited, as though he had already learned that truth moved slower than suspicion. One operations manager looked directly at Elijah. "How did you know that marker was underneath the label?" Elijah hesitated. His fingers brushed the worn baggage tag inside his pocket before he answered. "Because my father told me what to look for." The older employee slowly closed his eyes. "Your father's name?" Elijah lowered his voice. "Samuel Brooks." The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. The older employee inhaled sharply, but said nothing. Caroline noticed it immediately. There was recognition there, but also regret. Before she could ask another question, one of the managers interrupted. "There is another problem." He turned his tablet toward the supervisor. A faded maintenance report had appeared on the screen, but nearly every line had been marked unavailable after an archive conversion years earlier. Only a single sentence remained readable. "Property retained pending employee incident review." No names. No explanation. No conclusion. The supervisor rubbed his forehead. "This gets stranger by the minute." Elijah took one cautious step closer. "Please do not remove the old labels." "Why?" the supervisor demanded. Elijah looked down for a moment. "Because once they come off." He stopped himself again. "We lose the only thing that still connects it." The unfinished sentence hung in the air. Connects what? No one knew. Caroline looked from the suitcase to the teenager, then toward the airport managers. Can you verify anything else? One manager shook his head. Not from here. The original paper archive was moved years ago. The older employee suddenly spoke for the first time since hearing Samuel Brooks's name. Not all of it. Every face turned toward him. He pointed toward the opposite side of the terminal where an unmarked service hallway disappeared behind secure doors. Some of the oldest maintenance logs were never digitized. They are still stored downstairs. The supervisor immediately reached for his radio. Send someone. The older employee stopped him with surprising firmness. No. He fixed his eyes on Elijah. If that file says what I think it says, then this young man needs to be there when we open it. The terminal fell silent once more. After a long pause, the supervisor made his decision. Escort the suitcase, the boy, and Ms. Whitmore to the archive level. Nobody touches that baggage until we know exactly why Samuel Brooks's name still echoes through this airport. The service elevator descended beneath the terminal with a low mechanical hum that seemed louder than the conversations inside it. Elijah Brooks stood beside the gray suitcase without touching it, his faded charcoal hoodie wrinkled from the long morning, his old backpack resting against his shoulder. Caroline Whitmore remained opposite him, her phone vibrating twice with reminders for the international meeting she had now completely ignored. No one spoke until the doors opened onto a quiet basement corridor lined with steel shelves, yellow safety lights, and locked archive rooms that smelled faintly of old paper and machine oil. The older airport employee led the way with surprising confidence, stopping before a thick gray door marked maintenance records. He pulled an aging ring of keys from his pocket. Most people upstairs have never even seen this room, he murmured. Inside, rows of filing cabinets stretched farther than Elijah expected. Dust floated through narrow beams of fluorescent light. One operations manager searched the electronic catalog while another opened drawer after drawer by hand. Minutes passed with nothing but folders sliding across metal rails. Caroline glanced toward Elijah. He had not wandered. He had not asked questions. His eyes remained fixed on a single cabinet near the back wall, almost as if he already knew where something belonged. Why that cabinet? She asked softly. Elijah hesitated before answering. My father described it once. The older employee slowly turned toward him. Samuel brought you down here? Elijah shook his head. No. He told me about the room after he got sick. He said if the truth ever disappeared, it would still be waiting underground. The words lingered in the silence. Before anyone could respond, one of the managers called out. I found Brooks. Every head turned. A thick paper file rested in his hands, its edges worn with age. Across the front, faded black letters read Samuel Brooks, Facilities Maintenance. Beneath the name was a bright red stamp. Restricted Review. The supervisor carefully opened the folder. Most pages contained routine maintenance reports, inspection checklists, equipment repairs. Then he reached a section where several documents had been cleanly removed, leaving only torn binding holes behind. Someone took pages out, Caroline observed. Years ago, the older employee replied. Tucked between two remaining sheets was a single envelope sealed with brittle tape. On the front, someone had handwritten one instruction in blue ink. Do not separate from property. The room grew still. The supervisor looked from the envelope to the gray suitcase waiting outside the archive office. Property, he whispered. The suitcase. He carefully broke the old seal and unfolded one yellowed page. The paper had faded, but one paragraph remained readable. If this baggage is ever located, preserve every original identifier until ownership review is completed. Removing labels may permanently destroy historical evidence. The supervisor lowered the page slowly. Every decision made upstairs suddenly looked dangerously close to erasing something that could never be replaced. Caroline looked at Elijah with entirely different eyes now. The teenager had never asked anyone to open the suitcase. He had only begged them not to replace the labels. The realization settled heavily over everyone in the room. Then the operations manager studying the remaining documents stiffened. There is another attachment. He lifted a thin inventory sheet clipped behind the letter. Half the page had been blacked out decades earlier, but one line remained uncovered. Associated Witness, Caroline Whitmore Foundation Airport Development Program. Caroline frowned. That cannot be right. The older employee looked directly at her, his voice barely above a whisper. Your family's company was managing this airport when Samuel Brooks's file disappeared. No one spoke. The mystery had just shifted from a forgotten suitcase to the possibility that the airport's own history was tied to the woman standing beside Elijah. And somewhere inside the unopened gray suitcase waited the missing piece that could change both of their lives forever. No one reached for the suitcase. It remained in the middle of the archive room like a witness no one was ready to question. Caroline Whitmore stared at the inventory sheet still lying on the metal table. She had negotiated billion-dollar contracts without showing hesitation, yet the mention of her family's airport management company had drained the certainty from her face. "My grandfather owned the operating company," she said quietly. "I inherited the foundation years later. I have never seen this document before." The older employee nodded without judgment. "Neither had I. That is what worries me." Elijah stood silently beside the table. He did not look at Caroline with anger or accusation. Instead, he carefully unfolded the faded baggage tag once more and placed it beside the yellowed letter. The numbers almost matched. Almost. The operations manager leaned closer. One digit changed. Elijah gave a slow nod. "My father said the wrong number was not an accident." The room fell silent again. Nobody asked how a maintenance worker could have known that. Everyone wanted the answer, but no one wanted to rush it. The supervisor looked toward the unopened suitcase. "If the evidence is inside, we should open it now." Elijah stepped forward for the first time since entering the archive. "Please do not." His voice remained calm, but it carried enough conviction to stop every hand in the room. If the chain of custody is broken before the records are verified, people will say anything inside was planted. Caroline slowly turned toward him. That was not the reasoning of a frightened teenager trying to claim abandoned property. It was the reasoning of someone determined to protect evidence. Her opinion shifted another step. She looked at the supervisor. "He is right." The supervisor exhaled slowly before lowering his hand. "Then we verify first." Another archive drawer opened across the room. The older employee searched through a stack of oversized maintenance maps before pulling out a faded binder. A small photograph slipped from between the pages and landed face up on the concrete floor. Caroline instinctively bent down and picked it up. The image showed a group of airport maintenance employees standing beside newly installed equipment more than 20 years earlier. Time had faded the colors, but one face remained unmistakable. Elijah recognized his father immediately. Then Caroline's expression changed. She raised the photograph closer to the light. Standing only a few feet from Samuel Brooks was a younger man wearing a visitor badge with the Whitmore Airport Management logo. Caroline whispered almost involuntarily, "That is my father." No one spoke. The two men were not standing apart as strangers. Samuel Brooks had one hand resting on the other man's shoulder, both smiling naturally at the camera. The photograph quietly erased the assumption that their families had lived in separate worlds. The older employee accepted the picture with trembling fingers. "I remember this day," he murmured. They worked together during the terminal expansion. Elijah looked at Caroline for the first time since they had met upstairs. Neither blamed the other. Neither understood the whole truth. But for the first time, they shared the same unanswered question. If their fathers had trusted each other, why had Samuel Brooks's records vanished? Before anyone could speak again, one of the operations managers turned pale while examining another page inside the binder. "There is a transfer authorization." He swallowed hard. It was approved the week after this photograph was taken. The supervisor extended his hand. "Transfer of what?" The manager looked from the document to the unopened gray suitcase, then slowly shook his head. "Not what?" His voice barely carried across the room. "Whoever signed this ordered every item connected to Samuel Brooks's final airport assignment to be sealed, relocated, and never returned to the public archive." The room seemed to grow colder as the transfer authorization passed from one pair of hands to another. The signature at the bottom had faded until only a few strokes of ink remained, but the date was still clear. It matched the same week the photograph had been taken. Elijah Brooks stared at the page without reaching for it. His father had spent years telling him to protect a suitcase, a baggage tag, and a story that no one else believed existed. Yet even Samuel Brooks had never spoken about an order that erased an entire assignment from the public record. The security supervisor placed the document inside a protective sleeve. "This changes everything," he murmured. Before anyone could respond, the supervisor's radio crackled again. Operations control to archive level. Federal Records Compliance has acknowledged the restricted file. Their retrieval team is en route. Estimated arrival, 25 minutes. Every face in the room turned toward the radio. The operations manager spoke first. If Federal Records takes jurisdiction, every document, every photograph, and that suitcase leave with them. Elijah's eyes shifted toward the gray suitcase. He did not move. He simply stood there as though watching time slip away 1 minute at a time. Caroline Whitmore stepped closer to the supervisor. Can they stop our review? He answered honestly. If the restriction is still legally active, yes. Silence swallowed the room. The older employee slowly removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. We waited decades to find this file. His voice broke for the first time. Now we may lose it again before learning why it disappeared. Elijah finally spoke. That is exactly what my father feared. Caroline looked toward him. He knew this could happen? Elijah nodded once. He said if anyone important ever noticed the suitcase, they would try to take it before ordinary people could ask questions. No one challenged him. The prediction had already begun unfolding before their eyes. The operations manager hurried back to another filing cabinet, searching for any document that could override the restriction. Drawer after drawer slammed shut. Nothing. Another manager searched the digital archive. Screen after screen returned the same message. Access denied. Caroline unlocked her phone and contacted attorneys from her foundation. One after another answered with the same cautious advice. Do not interfere with a federal retrieval order until its legal basis is reviewed. She lowered the phone slowly. For the first time in years, her influence could not open a single locked door. Across the room, Elijah quietly walked to the gray suitcase. He crouched beside it without touching the handle. His fingers hovered inches above the overlapping baggage labels. Dad? He whispered so softly that only Caroline heard him. I do not know what else to do. She watched him in silence. The confident businessman inside her wanted solutions. The woman standing beside the teenager felt only the weight of a promise she had never made, but somehow now shared. Then the older employee gave a sudden gasp. Hidden inside the empty folder where the removed documents had once been, he discovered a tiny folded slip of paper no larger than a business card. On it, in Samuel Brooks's unmistakably neat handwriting, were only 9 words. Do not trust the first official answer. Find Mercer before opening anything. Mercer? The supervisor repeated. Who is Mercer? No one knew. Another radio transmission interrupted the question. Federal retrieval team has entered the airport. They are proceeding directly to archive level. Heavy footsteps echoed faintly through the concrete hallway outside. The supervisor looked toward the steel door, then back at the suitcase. 25 minutes had become less than 2. Whatever Samuel Brooks had spent his life trying to protect was about to disappear again unless someone could find the mysterious Mercer before the door opened. The steel door swung open just as 2 officials in navy jackets stepped into the archive corridor, carrying sealed evidence cases and federal credentials. Their arrival drained the last traces of hope from the room. Federal Records Compliance, the taller agent announced calmly. We are here to assume custody of all restricted materials connected to File Brooks. The supervisor looked at the clock, then at Elijah Brooks. The teenager did not protest. He simply slipped the worn baggage tag back into his pocket and took one quiet step away from the suitcase, as though preparing himself to watch history disappear a second time. Before the lead agent could reach the table, a voice echoed from the hallway behind them. If you remove that suitcase before reading the complete maintenance review, you will be repeating the same mistake made 23 years ago. Everyone turned. An elderly man with silver hair, a weathered leather briefcase, and a wooden cane walked slowly into the room. His posture was unsteady, but his eyes were sharp. The older airport employee immediately straightened. Daniel Mercer, he whispered. Elijah stared at the newcomer without recognition, but Caroline Whitmore inhaled sharply. She had seen his name in aviation journals for years. Mercer had spent decades documenting airport history and preservation standards across the United States. The lead federal agent frowned. Sir, this is a restricted investigation. Mercer calmly opened his briefcase instead of answering. Inside rested several thick binders protected in clear archival sleeves. He removed one and laid it beside Samuel Brooks's file. You are looking at incomplete records, he said. I brought the certified preservation copies Samuel asked me to keep if anything ever happened to him. Silence settled over the room. The supervisor carefully opened the binder. Inside were maintenance logs, engineering sketches, dated correspondence, and notarized preservation requests bearing official airport seals. Every page matched details already discovered inside the archive. The federal agent stepped closer, his expression changing with every document. "Where did you obtain these?" Mercer answered without hesitation. Samuel Brooks delivered them personally after realizing official copies had begun disappearing. Elijah slowly lifted his head. It was the first time all day someone had spoken his father's name with complete confidence instead of uncertainty. Mercer turned toward him. "Your father believed that truth should survive even when paperwork did not." Then he looked directly at Caroline. "And he trusted your father more than anyone else in management." Caroline blinked in disbelief. Mercer quietly removed the faded photograph they had already found and placed another copy beside it. On the reverse side, hidden beneath protective paper, was a handwritten note signed by both Samuel Brooks and Richard Whitmore. "Partners in preserving the truth until the proper review is completed." Caroline's hands trembled as she read the signature. Everything she had assumed about her family's role shifted in an instant. Her father had not hidden Samuel Brooks. He had helped him protect something they believed was in danger of being destroyed. The false story that had quietly shaped everyone's judgment throughout the day collapsed without a single argument. The lead federal agent closed the binder slowly. "These certified records were never included in our restricted file." Mercer nodded. "Because the restriction was never created to bury Samuel Brooks. It was created to prevent unauthorized access until every piece of evidence could be preserved together." Every eye drifted toward the unopened gray suitcase. It had never been abandoned property. It had always been the final piece of a protected historical record. The federal agent took a long breath before removing the evidence transfer form from his folder. Instead of signing it, he folded it in half and placed it back inside his case. "Custody is no longer the first priority," he said quietly. "Verification is." Then he looked directly at Elijah. "Young man, before anyone opens that suitcase, tell us why your father believed only you should decide when the waiting was finally over." Elijah lowered his eyes for a long moment before answering. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady enough to quiet the entire archive room. "My father never asked me to decide what was inside the suitcase," he said. "He asked me to decide when people were finally ready to care more about the truth than about protecting themselves." No one interrupted him. Daniel Mercer slowly smiled, not with triumph, but with relief. "That," he whispered, "is exactly what Samuel told me he hoped you would understand one day." The lead federal agent nodded once before carefully removing a fresh evidence seal from his case. Instead of placing it over the suitcase, he handed it to the supervisor. "Record that this property has entered historical preservation review." The supervisor peeled away the old evidence label that had nearly hidden the faded maintenance marker. For the first time in decades, the original blue identifier could be seen clearly beneath the layers of newer stickers. The older airport employee ran a trembling finger a fraction of an inch above it without making contact. "We almost covered this forever," he murmured. Caroline Whitmore watched the moment unfold in complete silence. Hours earlier, she had trusted procedures without question. Now she stepped beside the supervisor and quietly removed the airport executive visitor badge from around her neck. She placed it on the table next to Samuel Brooks's file. "Every internal record connected to this case will be reopened," she said. "Not because my family is involved, but because this airport owes the truth to every employee who walked these halls." No applause followed. The promise itself carried enough weight. Mercer carefully opened another archival sleeve from his briefcase. Inside rested certified copies of maintenance correspondence exchanged between Samuel Brooks and Richard Whitmore. Their signatures appeared side by side beneath recommendations that every original baggage label remain attached until a formal historical review could protect the evidence. The supervisor compared the letters with the instructions found inside the archive. Every date matched. Every signature aligned. Every missing piece slid into place with quiet precision. The false belief that Samuel Brooks had left behind abandoned property dissolved completely. He had been preserving history all along. The lead federal agent reached for the gray suitcase, then deliberately stopped halfway. He turned toward Elijah instead. Would you stand beside it? Elijah walked forward, resting one hand lightly against the worn fabric without touching the zipper. The faded baggage tag remained in his other hand. The agent photographed both together before sealing the documentation. Chain of custody preserved, he announced. Historical integrity confirmed. Caroline looked at Elijah with a warmth that had replaced every trace of doubt. You spent this entire day protecting something that was never yours, she said softly. Elijah shook his head. It always belonged to the people who deserved to remember. Even the older airport employee had to look away for a moment. The room that had begun the day, filled with suspicion, now felt almost reverent. Yet one question still lingered untouched. No one had opened the suitcase. No one knew whether its contents would finally explain why Samuel Brooks and Richard Whitmore had guarded it for more than 2 decades. Mercer closed his briefcase and looked toward the federal agent. The evidence has been verified, he said. The history has been restored. Then he turned to Elijah. Only one promise remains. Every eye followed the teenager as he slowly lifted the worn baggage tag and matched it against the original blue maintenance marker, now fully visible beneath the preserved labels. They aligned perfectly for the first time. Elijah closed his fingers around the tag, took one slow breath, and reached toward the zipper of the gray suitcase, knowing that whatever waited inside would not only finish his father's story, but would determine how an entire airport remembered it forever. Elijah Brooks rested his hand on the zipper for a brief moment, then looked toward Daniel Mercer before opening the suitcase. Mercer answered with a small nod, and the room became so quiet that even the soft pull of the metal zipper sounded impossibly loud. The lid lifted slowly. No stacks of money waited inside. No secret machine. No forgotten treasure. Folded carefully beneath protective cloth rested a weathered maintenance uniform, a hard hat carrying Samuel Brooks's employee number, a leather-bound logbook, and a sealed envelope addressed in neat blue handwriting. Across the front were 6 simple words. Open only after the truth survives. Elijah carefully lifted the envelope while the federal agent photographed every item without disturbing their arrangement. Caroline Whitmore remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the maintenance badge that still carried traces of dust from a career most travelers would never notice. Mercer quietly unfolded the logbook. Every page documented inspections, repairs, and handwritten observations until the final entries changed. Samuel had begun recording conversations instead of maintenance notes. One page described repeated pressure to discard damaged historical property after the terminal expansion. Another recorded that Richard Whitmore had refused to authorize its destruction until proper historical review could be completed. Neither man had tried to hide the evidence. They had chosen to protect it together after discovering that portions of the archive were disappearing during a records conversion. Mercer carefully handed the final page to the supervisor. It bore both men's signatures beneath a single sentence. History belongs to the people who remember honestly. Caroline slowly closed her eyes before reaching into her handbag. She removed the executive access card that opened every administrative office in the airport and placed it beside Samuel Brooks's maintenance badge. Tomorrow, she said quietly, the board will receive my recommendation that Samuel Brooks be formally recognized as a preservation officer whose work protected this airport's history. Every missing record connected to this case will be restored to the public archive. The supervisor nodded before adding his own airport identification card beside hers. And every employee will learn why a maintenance worker saved something the rest of us nearly erased. No celebration followed. The silence felt more respectful than applause ever could. A week later, sunlight poured through the terminal atrium, where travelers hurried beneath a newly installed historical display. Behind crystal-clear museum glass rested the gray suitcase exactly as it had been found, every original baggage label preserved, every faded mark visible, every layer telling part of the story that had almost disappeared forever. Beside it stood Samuel Brooks's uniform, Richard Whitmore's signed correspondence, and the photograph that showed 2 ordinary men smiling beside each other long before anyone realized what they had chosen to protect. Elijah visited quietly before school, wearing the same worn charcoal hoodie and carrying the same old backpack. Caroline arrived a few minutes later without reporters, photographers, or executives. She simply stood beside him as travelers stopped to read the exhibit. Some recognized the names. Most did not. But every person slowed down long enough to understand that the smallest labels often protected the biggest truths. Elijah slipped the faded baggage tag back into his pocket, no longer because it was the last link to his father, but because it had become a reminder that promises could outlive paperwork. As he turned to leave, morning light crossed the museum glass, and for one quiet instant the old gray suitcase reflected two families, one forgotten promise, and an airport that had finally learned to preserve the truth before moving on.